London, May 1818. The chandeliers of Almack's cast their golden glow across the polished floors, illuminating silk gowns that swirled like pastel clouds as couples moved through the quadrille. But in the shadows near the marble columns, where the candlelight seemed reluctant to reach, Miss Honoria Sinclair stood perfectly still, her gloved hands folded with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. 28 years old. 6 complete London seasons. Not a single proposal. The whispers followed her like a persistent ghost. The blue stocking, poor dear, quite hopeless, really. Honoria had long since stopped flinching at the words. She had become what the ton feared most, a woman who had accepted her fate with dignity rather than desperation. Her grey-blue eyes, sharp with intelligence that made gentlemen uncomfortable, surveyed the ballroom with the detachment of a natural philosopher, observing specimens under glass. What she did not know as she smoothed the modest muslin of her gown was that across the square in the exclusive confines of White's Club, her entire future was being wagered upon like a horse at Ascot. If you believe in stories where intelligence triumphs over cruelty, where the overlooked find their power, subscribe now. You will not want to miss what happens when a wallflower discovers she has been made the subject of a gentleman's wager. The betting book at White's Club lay open on the mahogany table, its cream pages filled with the idle wagers of England's finest gentlemen. Lord Tristan Ashcroft, Marquis of Greystone, regarded the challenge with the same mild interest one might afford a moderately engaging book of poetry. At 33 he possessed both the wealth and the reputation that rendered most entertainments tedious. His fortune from Cornish tin mines and extensive estates had placed him beyond financial concern, and his uncanny ability to predict successful matches each season had earned him the sobriquet, the Oracle. Lord Edmund Hartwell, barely 25 and newly come into his inheritance, leaned forward with the aggressive enthusiasm of youth seeking to make its mark. The port had loosened his tongue, and the presence of half a dozen witnesses emboldened his challenge. The young lord had spent his first season in London, observing the marriage mart, with the keen eye of someone who believed he had discovered patterns where others saw only chaos. He was wrong, of course, but youth rarely recognizes its own limitations. "Your so-called gift is nothing but observation of the obvious, Greystone," Edmund declared, his words carrying across the smoking room. "Any fool can predict that a diamond of the first water will secure an excellent match. The true test of your abilities would be to successfully manage the impossible." Tristan lifted his glass, examining the ruby liquid with more interest than he afforded the younger man. The port was exceptional, a vintage from his own cellars that he had sent over as a gesture of goodwill to the club's steward. It deserved better company than Edmund Hartwell's presumptuous proclamations. "And what, pray tell, do you consider impossible, Hartwell?" "That creature," Edmund gestured toward the window overlooking St. James's Street, though in truth he meant the assembly rooms beyond. "Miss Honoria Sinclair, 6 seasons on the marriage mart, 28 years old. A blue-stocking who reads Greek philosophy and debates politics at dinner parties. No gentleman of rank has offered for her, and none ever shall. She is too old, too intellectual, and too set in her unfortunate ways." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled company. Several had sisters or daughters who had been subjected to Miss Sinclair's unfortunate tendency to discuss Plato when polite conversation called for commentary on the weather or the latest fashions from Paris. Lord Hartwick, who had sat beside her at a dinner 3 months prior, still bore the psychological scars of her passionate discourse on the merits of Athenian democracy versus Roman republicanism. He had understood perhaps 1 word in 5 and had spent the entire evening feeling profoundly inadequate. "I wager £15,000, Edmund continued, warming to his theme as the assembled gentlemen turned their full attention to him, "that even the great oracle of the ton cannot secure her a match with an earl or higher within 6 weeks. Not merely an offer, mind you, but an actual betrothal. Documented, witnessed, and socially acknowledged." The room fell silent. £15,000 was no trifling sum, even among men of substantial means. It represented the annual income of a respectable gentleman, the price of a fine townhouse in Mayfair, or the dowry of a well-connected young lady. To wager such an amount on what amounted to a social experiment spoke either to Edmund's extraordinary confidence or his extraordinary foolishness. Tristan set down his glass with deliberate precision. The challenge itself held little appeal, but Edmund's smirking confidence grated against his better judgment. He had spent the better part of a decade cultivating his reputation through careful observation and strategic interventions in the marriage mart. To refuse such a public challenge would suggest either fear or acknowledgement that his abilities had limits. His pride, that most treacherous of counselors, whispered that he could not possibly fail at something he had been doing successfully for years. "Very well," he said, his tone betraying nothing of his thoughts. 6 weeks to secure Miss Sinclair a match with an earl or higher. No bribery, no coercion, no financial inducements offered to potential suitors. Merely the application of social influence and strategic positioning. The tools of the ton, wielded with precision. "Agreed," Edmund said eagerly, already reaching for the betting book with hands that trembled slightly from excitement or port or both. "And should you fail, you will pay me £15,000 and dance the opening set of next season with a lady of my choosing, thereby publicly declaring your interest in matrimony and subjecting yourself to the very marriage mart you have so successfully navigated on behalf of others." The terms were recorded in the club's official ledger, witnessed and signed by no fewer than 8 gentlemen of impeccable standing. The club's secretary noted the date, the stakes, and the deadline in his meticulous copper-plate hand. By morning, every drawing room in Mayfair would know of the wager. The betting book at White's was, after all, London's most efficient means of spreading gossip among the upper 10,000. The Oracle had accepted his most impossible challenge yet, and society would watch with bated breath to see whether Miss Honoria Sinclair, the wallflower whom 6 seasons had failed to marry off, would finally find a gentleman willing to overlook her advanced age and unfortunate intellectual tendencies. What none of them could have predicted was that Miss Honoria Sinclair would prove far more formidable than any of them imagined, and that by the end of 6 weeks it would not be clear who had won and who had lost, only that the game had changed entirely. The following Tuesday found Honoria in her customary refuge, Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly. The familiar scent of leather bindings and aged paper provided a comfort that ballrooms never could. The shop was relatively quiet at this hour, with only a handful of other customers browsing the well-stocked shelves. She ran her fingers along the spines of newly arrived volumes, pausing at a translation of Aristotle's Ethics that she had been anticipating for months. The German scholar Becker had promised a revolutionary new approach to the text, and Honoria was eager to compare his interpretations with her own understanding of the original Greek. "I believe you will find Becker's commentary particularly illuminating on the question of eudaimonia," a cultured voice observed from directly behind her. Honoria turned to find herself facing Lord Tristan Ashcroft, Marquis of Greystone, a man she had seen countless times across crowded ballrooms, but to whom she had never been formally introduced. He was taller than she had realized, perhaps 6 feet in height, with dark blonde hair that showed hints of lighter streaks from time spent outdoors. His eyes were a penetrating shade of blue that seemed to assess her with genuine interest, rather than the dismissive glance she had grown accustomed to receiving from gentlemen of rank. His attire was impeccable, without being ostentatious, the mark of a man whose wealth was so secure that he need not advertise it. "You are familiar with Becker's work, my lord?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. In 6 years of London society, no gentleman had ever initiated a conversation with her about philosophical texts. Most could not differentiate between Aristotle and Aristophanes, and would not have cared to learn. "I make it a practice to read whatever scholars deem worthy of translation," he replied, gesturing to the volume in her hands with a graceful movement that suggested both education and athletic ability. "Though I confess my Greek is serviceable at best, I rely heavily on the commentary to illuminate the finer points of philosophical argument. My tutor at Cambridge despaired of ever teaching me proper pronunciation, though I can puzzle through written texts with adequate comprehension." It was the most intellectually engaged conversation Honoria had experienced with a gentleman in 6 years of London seasons. She felt herself relaxing slightly, her usual defensive posture softening in the face of what appeared to be genuine scholarly interest. Before she could formulate a response that would not betray her astonishment, Tristan continued. "I'm hosting a small gathering at Greystone House this Friday evening, a salon of sorts with several scholars presenting their current research. Professor Holloway from Cambridge will be discussing recent archaeological discoveries in Greece, particularly his work on the Parthenon friezes. Dr. Morrison from the Royal Society will present his findings on ancient astronomical observations. I wonder if you might honor us with your presence, Miss Sinclair. Your reputation as a scholar of classical texts precedes you, and I believe you would contribute significantly to the discussions." Honoria's mind raced through the possible explanations for this extraordinary invitation. Gentlemen of the Marquis's standing did not seek out blue stockings for intellectual companionship. They certainly did not invite unmarried ladies of modest fortune to private gatherings at their homes, even with the presence of other guests. The social impropriety was minimal, given the intellectual nature of the gathering and the presence of his aunt as chaperone, but the very fact that he had thought to invite her at all suggested motivations she could not immediately discern. "I am acquainted with your work, my lord," she asked carefully, watching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. "No," he admitted with disarming honesty that seemed almost calculated in its frankness. "But I have made inquiries. Lady Jersey mentioned that you once corrected her son's Latin translation at a dinner party, and that your grasp of Cicero exceeded that of his Cambridge tutors. Lord Hartwick, though he still appears somewhat traumatized by the experience, spoke of your extensive knowledge of Greek political philosophy, and Professor Holloway himself, when I mentioned my intention to invite accomplished scholars to this gathering, immediately suggested that I seek out a Miss Sinclair who had been corresponding with him regarding her own translation work." "Lady Jersey was being generous," Honoria replied carefully, though in truth she remembered the incident well. Young Lord Jersey had been butchering Cicero's Proarchia, mangling the Latin in ways that suggested his expensive Cambridge education had been entirely wasted. She had been unable to contain her correction, delivered with perhaps more pedagogical fervor than strict politeness allowed. The boy's mother had not seemed pleased at the time, though apparently her opinion had mellowed with reflection. "Nevertheless, I would be honored by your attendance. I shall send a formal invitation to your father, Sir Reginald. The gathering will be entirely respectable, I assure you. My aunt, the Dowager Marchioness, serves as hostess for such events. She is a formidable woman who tolerates no impropriety, though she encourages vigorous intellectual debate. Her own salon in Bath was legendary in its day." He bowed with perfect propriety and departed, leaving Honoria standing among the bookshelves with Aristotle clutched in her hands and her carefully constructed understanding of her place in society suddenly uncertain. She watched through the shop window as he climbed into an elegant barouche, the greystone crest gleaming on the door panel. A liveried footman held the door, and the equipage pulled smoothly into Piccadilly traffic, with the efficiency that marked the households of the truly wealthy. What she did not know was that Tristan had spent the previous 3 days making careful inquiries about her habits, her interests, and her daily routines. The seemingly chance encounter had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. He had learned that she visited Hatchard's every Tuesday morning, that she favored the philosophy section, and that she had been awaiting the arrival of Becker's new translation. He had purchased his own copy the previous day and spent the evening reading enough to speak intelligently about its contents. The salon at Greystone House exceeded Honoria's modest expectations by such a degree that she found herself momentarily speechless upon arrival. The library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and reading alcoves illuminated by dozens of beeswax candles, had been arranged to accommodate perhaps 20 guests. The furniture was arranged in intimate groupings that encouraged conversation, while still permitting free movement between discussions. Small tables held refreshments, scholarly journals lay open for perusal, and a lectern had been positioned near the fireplace for formal presentations. She recognized several distinguished scholars whose work she had read, 2 members of Parliament, known for their intellectual pursuits rather than mere political maneuvering, and a scandalously small number of ladies. Perhaps 5 women attended, all of whom appeared to be scholars or wives of scholars, rather than the typical society ladies who graced most London gatherings. This was not a typical society event designed to facilitate courtship and gossip. This was an actual meeting of minds, the kind of intellectual gathering she had read about in accounts of Parisian salons, but had never expected to experience in London's rigid social hierarchy. The Dowager Marchioness, a sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 70 years, greeted each guest personally. When Honoria was presented, the older woman studied her with undisguised assessment. "Miss Sinclair, my nephew speaks very highly of your work on Platonic texts. I look forward to hearing your perspectives this evening. I myself studied with Professor Bentley at Cambridge many years ago, before the university became quite so stuffy about admitting women to lectures. One had to be creative about gaining access to education in those days. Professor Halloway's presentation on the Parthenon friezes proved absolutely fascinating. He had spent 2 years in Greece, studying the remaining sculptures and comparing them with accounts from ancient texts. His theory that the frieze represented a specific historical event, rather than merely mythological scenes, generated immediate debate. Honoria found herself drawn into an animated discussion with him, 2 other scholars, and a gentleman from the British Museum about the proper interpretation of certain symbolic elements. "The procession surely represents the Panathenaic festival," one scholar insisted. "The presence of the peplos alone confirms that interpretation." "But the number of figures suggests a specific commemoration rather than an annual ritual," Honoria countered, warming to the debate in a way she never could at typical society gatherings. If one accepts Thucydides' account of the Persian Wars, the positioning of the cavalry might represent specific military units rather than generic participants. It would align with what we know of Athenian practices of commemorating significant victories. "Your point about the procession representing civic rather than purely religious ceremony is well taken," Tristan interjected from where he had positioned himself nearby, listening with apparent interest. "It aligns with what we know of Athenian democratic practice. The integration of military, political, and religious elements was characteristic of that society. They would not have separated these spheres in the way we moderns tend to do." The discussion continued for another quarter hour, ranging across topics from Periclean Athens to modern parliamentary reform, from ancient democracy to contemporary political philosophy. Honoria felt more intellectually alive than she had in months, perhaps years. This was what she had imagined London society might offer, before 6 seasons of stilted conversation and dismissive glances had taught her otherwise. It was only when the Dowager Marchioness announced that refreshments were served in the dining room that the group dispersed. Tristan offered his arm to Honoria with perfect propriety, the gesture neither too familiar nor too distant. "I am gratified to discover that my sources were entirely accurate regarding your scholarly abilities, Miss Sinclair. Your contributions to the discussion were invaluable." "Your sources, my lord?" She allowed him to escort her toward the dining room, acutely aware of the curious glances from other guests. A marquess escorting an unmarried lady was not scandalous in itself, but his exclusive attention was certainly notable. "I confess to having made inquiries before extending my invitation. I wished to ensure that the gathering would prove stimulating rather than merely fashionable. The ton has quite enough of the latter and far too little of the former. My aunt agrees, which is why she permits me to host these gatherings despite their unconventional nature. She believes, and I concur, that intellectual discourse elevates society far more effectively than another tedious ball featuring the same conversations about the weather and Lady Somebody's new bonnet." They entered the dining room, where an elegant cold supper had been laid out on gleaming silver platters. Tristan guided her to a seat near Lady Jersey and the Countess de Leven, 2 of the most influential patronesses of Almack's and arbiters of social acceptability. Both ladies greeted her with considerably more warmth than they had ever displayed during her 6 seasons of attending events they supervised. "My dear Miss Sinclair," Lady Jersey said, her tone genuinely cordial rather than the polite condescension Honoria had grown accustomed to, "Lord Greystone has been singing your praises quite enthusiastically. He tells us you are translating Plato's Symposium. How perfectly fascinating. I confess my own Greek is sadly inadequate to the task. You must tell us about your approach to the translation." The conversation that followed was unlike any Honoria had experienced in a social setting. These powerful women, whose approval could make or break a young lady's social standing, were treating her with genuine respect, rather than patronizing tolerance. They asked intelligent questions about her work, expressed authentic interest in her opinions on a range of topics from literature to politics, and made it abundantly clear that they considered her intellectual pursuits admirable rather than eccentric. Lady Jersey even mentioned a young cousin who wished to study classics and wondered if Miss Sinclair might consider tutoring the girl. As the evening concluded and Sir Reginald Sinclair's modest carriage arrived to collect his daughter, Honoria found herself in a state of profound confusion. She had spent 6 years being tolerated at best and mocked at worst by society. Now, in the space of a single evening, she had been treated as a valued guest by some of the ton's most influential figures. The intellectual stimulation alone would have been remarkable, but the social implications were staggering. She did not yet suspect that every aspect of the evening had been carefully designed to achieve precisely that result. Tristan Ashcroft, watching her departure from the library window, allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The first phase of his campaign was complete. Lady Jersey and the Countess de Leven would spread word throughout society that Miss Sinclair was a woman of remarkable accomplishment. Within a week, her social standing would be transformed. What he had not anticipated was how genuinely enjoyable he would find her company. Her mind was indeed formidable, her arguments well constructed and supported by extensive knowledge. She engaged with ideas rather than merely accepting received wisdom. For a man who had spent years navigating the tedious superficiality of society courtship, where conversations rarely progressed beyond weather and fashion, the intellectual stimulation was unexpectedly pleasant. He found himself looking forward to their next encounter, not merely as the next step in his strategic campaign, but because he genuinely wished to continue their discussion of Athenian democracy and its relevance to modern political structures. It was a complication he had not foreseen, and one he would come to regret not examining more carefully before proceeding further down this particular path. The invitations began arriving within days, each one a small rectangle of heavy paper that represented a stunning reversal of Honoria's social fortunes. Lady Harrington requested her presence at a literary discussion on Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Featherstone invited her to a morning musical on Saturday. The Countess de Leven included her in a select gathering at the Russian embassy the following week. Each hostess mentioned, with varying degrees of subtlety, that Lord Greystone had recommended her as a guest whose conversation would elevate their entertainments. Sir Reginald, her father, was delighted by this sudden surge in his daughter's social prospects. A baronet of modest means whose own father had purchased the title through commercial success in the India trade, he had despaired of ever seeing his blue-stocking daughter respectably married. "Perhaps this season shall prove different after all, my dear," he said over breakfast one morning, surveying the array of gilt-edged cards with paternal satisfaction. "You have finally attracted the notice of people who matter. I always said your education would serve you well, though I confess I had my doubts during these past 6 years." Honoria was less optimistic, or perhaps more realistic. She understood social dynamics well enough to recognize orchestrated influence when she experienced it. The Marquis of Greystone was using his considerable power to elevate her standing, but she could not fathom why. Gentlemen of his rank and wealth did not expend such effort on unmarried ladies of modest fortune unless they had matrimonial intentions, and it strained credulity to imagine that the ton's most eligible bachelor had developed a sudden interest in a 6-season wallflower, whose primary accomplishments involved reading dead languages and debating ancient philosophy. There had to be another explanation, but she could not discern what it might be. Perhaps he sought a blue-stocking companion for intellectual discourse without the complications of romantic attachment. Perhaps he genuinely wished to promote female education and saw her as a test case for whether society would accept learned women. Perhaps he was conducting some kind of social experiment, though to what end she could not imagine. Her suspicions deepened when she encountered Tristan at the Harringtons' literary evening 3 days after the salon. He appeared at her side with the casual inevitability of a man who had timed his arrival precisely to coincide with her own. The coincidence was too perfect, the timing too exact. Honoria, who had spent 6 years observing social patterns with the analytical eye of a natural philosopher, recognized calculated behavior when she saw it. "Miss Sinclair," he greeted her, bowing over her hand with the practiced grace that marked a gentleman of his breeding. "I had hoped to find you here. I have been reading your observations on Platonic idealism and found myself with several questions that I believe only you can adequately address." He had written to his own former tutor at Cambridge, who in turn mentioned his correspondence with a brilliant unnamed female scholar whose insights on Platonic philosophy had challenged his own understanding of the texts. Upon discovering her identity through discreet inquiry, Tristan had requested copies of the philosophical arguments, claiming scholarly interest in the ongoing academic debate. That he had not only read them, but engaged deeply with the arguments demonstrated either genuine intellectual interest or extraordinarily thorough preparation for this campaign. They spent the better part of an hour in discussion, their voices low and their heads bent close together in the manner of scholars engaged in serious debate. They were unaware that Lady Harrington was ensuring that every influential matron in attendance took careful note of the Marquess's exclusive attention to Miss Sinclair. The hostess had received very clear instructions from Lady Jersey that Miss Sinclair was to be accorded every social consideration, and that any gentleman showing her marked attention should be encouraged rather than discouraged. By the time Honoria departed, 3 separate ladies had mentioned to their companions that Lord Greystone appeared to be seriously courting the Sinclair girl. How terribly romantic that he valued intelligence over mere beauty. The whispers spread through drawing rooms and morning calls like seeds finding fertile ground. Miss Honoria Sinclair, the blue-stocking wallflower whom 6 seasons had failed to marry off, had somehow captured the interest of the ton's most discerning bachelor. Invitations multiplied exponentially. Gentlemen who had never spared her a second glance suddenly found reasons to request introductions. Her dance card, empty for 6 consecutive seasons, suddenly required careful management. Hostesses who had previously relegated her to corners with elderly chaperones now positioned her prominently, eager to claim credit for facilitating what promised to be the most surprising match of the season. Through it all, Tristan Ashcroft remained a constant presence. He appeared at the same events she attended, always arriving shortly after her own arrival and departing shortly before her departure. He engaged her in substantive conversation about philosophy, literature, and politics. He introduced her to influential people who could advance her social standing. He treated her with a respect that she had never experienced from a gentleman of rank, as though her opinions mattered and her intellect was something to be celebrated rather than tolerated or mocked. He never overstepped propriety, never presumed upon their growing acquaintance, never suggested anything beyond respectful intellectual partnership. But his interest was unmistakable to anyone observing, and in London society, everyone was always observing everyone else. The betting book at White's began to fill with secondary wagers about whether the Oracle would actually marry Miss Sinclair himself rather than simply facilitating a match with another Earl. The odds, remarkably, were becoming increasingly favourable toward a match with Greystone himself. What Honoria could not know was that Tristan's own feelings had become increasingly complicated. He had entered this wager with clinical detachment, viewing it as an interesting challenge that would reinforce his reputation while teaching young Edmund Hartwell a valuable lesson about underestimating both the Oracle's abilities and the potential of supposedly impossible cases. But Miss Honoria Sinclair was not the dusty bluestocking he had expected. She was sharp-witted and occasionally funny. She challenged his interpretations of texts without being confrontational. She treated ideas with seriousness, but could also recognize absurdity when she encountered it. And when she smiled, truly smiled rather than offering the polite grimace that passed for smiles in most society interactions. Her entire face transformed into something approaching beauty. He found himself thinking about her between their encounters, wondering what she would make of an argument he had read in the Edinburgh Review, anticipating her reactions to various social situations, looking forward to their next conversation with an eagerness that had nothing to do with winning wagers and everything to do with the simple pleasure of her company. It was a development that should have alarmed him, but instead felt almost inevitable, as though he had been moving toward this realization from the moment he had first heard her correct Professor Halloway's interpretation of Athenian democratic practice. 3 weeks into Tristan's campaign, Miss Charlotte Featherstone invited Honoria to take tea at her family's townhouse in Berkeley Square. Charlotte, a vivacious blonde who had married well in her second season to a wealthy but intellectually negligible baron, possessed the unique combination of excellent social connections and notoriously loose tongue that made her London's most efficient distributor of gossip. She collected information like other ladies collected bonnets and dispensed it with similar enthusiasm. "My dear Honoria," Charlotte gushed as soon as the tea was poured and the servants dismissed from the small drawing room, "you simply must tell me how you managed to capture the attention of Lord Greystone. Every mama in London has been throwing her daughter at him for years, and he has remained utterly indifferent to all their machinations. Perfectly polite, mind you, but entirely unavailable. Now suddenly he can barely be separated from your side. The transformation is absolutely extraordinary." Honoria set down her teacup with careful precision, feeling the delicate porcelain tremble slightly in her fingers. "Lord Greystone and I share intellectual interests. I imagine he finds it refreshing to discuss philosophy and political theory, rather than merely the latest fashions from Paris or who wore what to which ball." "Oh, how wonderfully romantic that sounds," Charlotte replied, leaning forward conspiratorially with the gleam in her eye that always preceded her most devastating revelations. "A meeting of true minds, appreciation of inner beauty, and intellectual compatibility. Though of course you know about the wager." The room seemed to contract around Honoria, the air suddenly difficult to breathe. Her heart, which had been beating normally, suddenly accelerated to an uncomfortable pace. "The wager? Goodness, you have not heard. I assumed everyone knew by now. It is written right there in the betting book at White's for anyone to see. My brother read it to me and he says everyone has been talking about nothing else for weeks." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with the malicious pleasure of being first to deliver shocking news, though she seemed oblivious to the actual impact her words were having. "Lord Hartwell challenged Lord Greystone to secure you a match with an earl or higher within 6 weeks. The stake is £15,000. 15,000. Can you imagine? They made the wager 3 weeks ago, just before Lord Greystone began his sudden campaign to elevate your social standing." She continued speaking, utterly oblivious to the color draining from Honoria's face or the way her hands had gone completely still on the tea table. "So of course most of us believe Lord Greystone will win the wager by offering for you himself. He is a marquis after all, far superior to a mere earl. And he certainly seems interested enough, always at your side, always defending your intellectual pursuits to anyone who questions them, though I suppose he could just as easily arrange a match with some other gentleman if he wished merely to win the bet without committing himself. Lord Thornbury has been showing considerable interest lately, and he is an earl. That would satisfy the terms of the wager nicely, while allowing Lord Greystone to maintain his bachelor status." Honoria heard little of what followed through the roaring in her ears. Her mind had gone numb, then blazing with a humiliation so profound it threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought. Every conversation, every shared intellectual discussion, every moment she had begun to believe that someone finally valued her mind rather than dismissing it, all of it had been calculated strategy. She was not a person to be respected, a mind to be engaged, a woman whose company was valued. She was a challenge to be conquered, an impossible case whose successful resolution would net a gentleman £15,000 and bragging rights among his peers for years to come. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its casual thoughtlessness. These men had looked at her life, her dignity, her carefully maintained composure through 6 years of social rejection, and had decided it would make excellent entertainment over port and cigars. How they must have laughed, imagining the oracle working his magic on the hopeless bluestocking. How amusing they must have found the whole scenario. She excused herself from Charlotte's presence as soon as politeness permitted, pleading a headache that was not entirely fabricated. Her skull felt as though it might split from the pressure building behind her eyes. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of shame and anger that kept shifting and transforming, one emotion bleeding into the other, until she could not separate them. By the time she reached her father's modest townhouse on the less fashionable end of Grosvenor Square, the shame had crystallized into something harder and more useful. Cold, determined fury. Honoria spent that evening in her father's library, not reading but planning with the methodical precision she usually reserved for complex translations. She possessed certain advantages in this sudden war that Tristan Ashcroft did not anticipate. She had spent 6 years observing society's intricate mechanisms, learning its unwritten rules, cataloguing its weaknesses and vanities. She knew which matrons were rivals, which gentlemen harbored grudges against each other, which families had secrets they desperately wished to conceal. Information that had seemed merely academic curiosity, the observations of a natural philosopher studying a peculiar social ecosystem, now became an arsenal. More importantly, she understood something fundamental about wages among gentlemen, especially wages recorded in the betting books of places like White's. They were matters of pride as much as money. Tristan's reputation as the oracle depended on his ability to successfully navigate the complexities of the marriage mart on behalf of others. If she could make him fail publicly and spectacularly, the damage to his standing would far exceed the financial loss of £15,000. Her first action was deceptively simple. She would continue to accept his attentions, but ensure that they never progressed toward any actual proposal. She would be pleasant, intellectually engaging, seemingly receptive, but always just out of reach. Like a skilled chess player, she would control the board while allowing her opponent to believe he still had the advantage. Let him think his campaign was succeeding while she subtly sabotaged every move toward actual matrimonial commitment. Her second strategy required more delicacy and more thorough understanding of social dynamics. She would plant seeds of doubt about Tristan's motivations and, more cunningly, about his financial stability. The Tun thrived on speculation and rumor. She needed only to provide the initial suggestion and allow society's insatiable appetite for scandal to do the rest. The next morning, Honoria appeared at the Harringtons' garden party, looking particularly lovely in a pale blue muslin gown that complemented her auburn coloring. She had taken unusual care with her appearance, styling her hair in a more fashionable arrangement with the help of her mother's lady's maid, and wearing her mother's pearl necklace and matching earrings. The transformation was subtle but effective. Several ladies remarked that Miss Sinclair was looking remarkably well these days, and wasn't it wonderful what a bit of social success could do for a woman's appearance? Tristan appeared shortly after noon, gravitating to her side with the consistency she had come to expect. The predictability of his behavior would have been touching if it were genuine. "Miss Sinclair, you look especially radiant today. The pearls are particularly becoming." "You are too kind, my lord," she replied, offering him a smile that revealed nothing of her true thoughts or the cold fury burning beneath her composed exterior. "I am enjoying the gardens immensely. Lady Harrington's roses are particularly fine this year. The yellow ones near the north wall are spectacular." They strolled along the gravelled paths, discussing a recent article in the Edinburgh Review about parliamentary reform. To any observer, they appeared to be an intellectually matched couple, enjoying a pleasant afternoon in spring sunshine. Honoria waited until they were within earshot of Mrs. Montfort and Lady Sinclair, two of the Tun's most notorious gossips, whose ability to spread information rivaled the fastest mail coach, before executing her first strategic move. "I confess I was surprised by your invitation to your salon, my lord," she said, her voice pitched to carry clearly without seeming to intend it. "Such generosity towards someone of my modest standing is quite extraordinary, though I suppose recent events might explain such unusual attention to persons outside one's typical social circle." Tristan's expression flickered with confusion, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him since discovering the wager. "Recent events, Miss Sinclair?" "Oh, forgive me," she replied with apparently innocent concern, widening her eyes slightly in the manner of ladies who accidentally revealed information they should have kept confidential. "I should not have presumed to mention business matters. It is merely that I heard certain whispers regarding investments and difficulties with mining operations. I thought perhaps you might have been seeking to broaden your acquaintances in anticipation of potential changes to your social situation. But I am certain such rumors are entirely unfounded. You know how society loves to gossip about absolutely nothing at all." She changed the subject smoothly, launching into a question about his interpretation of a platonic dialogue, leaving Tristan puzzled and the two matrons immediately alert, like hunting dogs catching a scent. Mrs. Montford waited precisely 15 minutes before approaching another cluster of ladies, mentioning oh so casually that Miss Sinclair had hinted at some financial difficulty involving Lord Greystone. By sunset, half of Mayfair believed the Marquis's Cornish tin mines were failing spectacularly, and that he faced potential ruin unless he secured an advantageous marriage soon. Over the following days, Honoria continued her careful campaign with the precision of a master strategist. She attended every event where Tristan appeared, ensuring that her growing popularity, a popularity he had created through his machinations, remained visible and served her purposes rather than his. But she deftly avoided any situation that might lead to a private conversation about matrimony. When he suggested a drive in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, she ensured her younger cousin, Miss Sarah Worthington, accompanied them as chaperone. When he called at her father's house, she arranged for various family members to constantly interrupt with questions, needs, and domestic emergencies that prevented any serious conversation. Simultaneously, she cultivated attention from other gentlemen with the same strategic care Tristan had used to elevate her social standing. Lord Thornbury, an earl with extensive Yorkshire estates and a reputation for solid, if unimaginative, character, had begun to show interest now that she was socially acceptable. The Duke of Clarence's younger brother, newly returned from military service in the peninsula and bearing the romantic appeal of a war hero, sought her conversation at several gatherings. She encouraged both, not with any intention of accepting potential offers, but to demonstrate that Tristan was not her only prospect. The more alternatives she appeared to have, the less urgent his suit would seem, and the more time would elapse toward that 6-week deadline. The rumours about Greystone's finances gained momentum through careful feedback. At Lady Montrose's musicale, Honoria happened to mention to Miss Vanessa Hartwick that she found it curious how suddenly the Marquis had developed interest in a woman with even a modest dowry, particularly given that her father had recently invested successfully in canal shares. At the Duchess of Richmond's ball, she mused aloud to two younger ladies that it was terribly romantic how Lord Greystone seemed untroubled by differences in fortune, though of course she could never accept a gentleman who might have matrimonial motivations beyond genuine affection. One must protect oneself from fortune hunters, after all, regardless of their rank. The brilliance of her strategy lay in never stating anything directly. She merely raised questions, expressed innocent confusion, voiced gentle concerns couched in language that suggested she was defending Tristan against unfair speculation. Society's own appetite for scandal and its tendency to believe the worst transformed her subtle suggestions into elaborate narratives about Lord Greystone's desperate need for an influx of capital to save his failing tin mines and over-leveraged estates. Banking concerns began making quiet inquiries about the Marquis's investments, prompted by casual mentions from their aristocratic clients. Creditors reviewed his accounts with suddenly anxious eyes, despite the fact that his financial position was actually impeccable. Hostesses who had welcomed his presence began to wonder privately if his attendance might embarrass them should the financial rumors prove true. Within 2 weeks, Tristan Ashcroft found himself in the unprecedented position of being socially analyzed and questioned rather than automatically welcomed and deferred to. Meanwhile, the 6-week deadline drew inexorably closer. Tristan's frustration mounted as every attempt to advance his suit met with pleasant but impassable obstacles. Honoria remained gracious, intellectually engaging, apparently receptive to his company, but somehow always unavailable when circumstances might have permitted a private conversation that could lead to a proposal. He could not comprehend what had changed. One day she had been warming to his attentions, relaxing in his company, engaging with genuine enthusiasm in their intellectual discussions. The next, she had become as elusive as smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. What disturbed him more profoundly than the failure of his strategic campaign was his own reaction to her elusiveness. The realization crept up on him gradually, then struck him with the force of a runaway carriage. He had entered this wager with clinical detachment, viewing it as an interesting social challenge that would reinforce his reputation while teaching young Edmund Hartwell a valuable lesson about underestimating the oracle's abilities. But somewhere during their conversations about Aristotle and Athenian democracy, during heated debates about political reform and the proper role of government in citizens' lives, during moments when her laughter at his dry wit had been genuine and unguarded, his own motivations had shifted entirely. Honoria Sinclair was not the dried-up blue-stocking Edmund Hartwell had dismissed with such casual cruelty. She was brilliant, resilient, principled, and possessed of a quiet dignity that shamed the superficial charms of typical society beauties. When she challenged his interpretations of classical texts, he found himself energized rather than annoyed, stimulated rather than insulted. When she advocated for educational reform and the expansion of opportunities for women with passionate eloquence, he wanted to support her causes with his considerable wealth and influence. And when she smiled at him with those intelligent grey-blue eyes, he felt something he had never experienced in 33 years of navigating society. He was falling in love with her, had fallen in love with her, was completely and irrevocably in love with a woman who thought he was pursuing her for £15,000 and bragging rights. The realization struck him with uncomfortable force during a particularly tedious ball at Devonshire House. He had been watching her dance with Lord Thornbury, noting how the Earl's attention had become increasingly marked, how he had requested 2 dances when one would have been sufficient, how he leaned slightly too close when speaking with her. The flash of jealousy that seized Tristan's chest was entirely irrational and completely undeniable. He did not want Honoria married to some plodding earl to satisfy a foolish wager he never should have accepted. He wanted her for himself, partnered with him in intellectual discourse and personal intimacy, sharing their lives with the equality that their matching minds deserved. But how could he possibly propose now, when doing so would confirm every suspicion that his interest had been merely strategic? She would believe him motivated by the wager, rather than by genuine feeling. He had created an impossible situation through his own arrogance, trapped by circumstances of his own making. He was the oracle who could navigate anyone else's matrimonial complications, but had thoroughly entangled himself in his own. It was then that Edmund Hartwell approached, his expression smug with anticipated victory. The young lord had been watching the campaign's progress with growing satisfaction, convinced that even the great oracle could not overcome the impossible odds. "Only 4 days remain, Greystone. Shall you admit defeat now, or do you prefer to watch your reputation as the oracle crumble publicly when the deadline expires without any betrothal? I must say, I am enjoying this spectacle immensely." Tristan looked at the younger man with contempt he no longer bothered to conceal. "I shall pay your damned wager tomorrow, Hartwell. Consider yourself £15,000 richer. You may collect your winnings at Coutts Bank at your convenience." Edmund's eyes widened with shock, his smug expression transforming into confusion. "You concede before the deadline? But you still have 4 days. Surely you could accomplish something in that time." "I concede that participating in your wager was a mistake of judgment I deeply regret. More than that, I concede that Miss Sinclair deserves better than to be treated as a challenge or a project or an impossible case to be solved. She is a remarkable woman, whose worth exceeds anything that can be measured in wages or social standing. Now remove yourself from my presence before I forget we are both supposed to be gentlemen." He turned away from Edmund's astonishment and made his way through the crowded ballroom with single-minded purpose. He needed to speak with Honoria immediately, to confess everything, to throw himself on her mercy and hope that somehow she might understand that his feelings had transcended the circumstances of their origin. He had to try, even knowing he would likely fail, because the alternative was allowing her to continue believing that his regard was false. He found her in the conservatory, standing before a display of exotic orchids and escaping the crush of the ball much as he was. She stood motionless, her face pensive in the moonlight filtering through the glass panels overhead. For a moment he simply observed her, memorizing the picture she made against the backdrop of tropical plants, knowing this might be the last time she would permit him in her presence. "Miss Sinclair," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her, but needing to announce his presence. "Might I have a moment of your time? I have something I must tell you, and I fear I can no longer delay the confession." She turned to face him slowly, and something in her expression made his carefully prepared speech dissolve unspoken. She knew. Of course she knew. Her intelligence was formidable, her observations of society sharp and penetrating. She had likely known from the beginning, or at least from early enough, that his every action since had been viewed through the lens of that knowledge. "You have discovered the wager," he said, the words more statement than question. "I have known for 3 weeks," she replied, her voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested roiling emotion held tightly under control. "Since Miss Featherstone kindly informed me that I had become the subject of entertainment at White's Club. She thought I would find it amusing or flattering. Instead, I found it devastating." The quiet devastation in her tone struck him more forcefully than anger would have. Anger he could have argued against, defended himself from, combated with logic. This subdued hurt was far more damaging because it was entirely justified. "Honoria, please permit me to explain." "Explain what, my lord?" Her voice was still controlled, but he heard the edge of ice beneath it. "That you accepted a wager to manipulate me into marriage for the amusement of your peers. That every conversation, every shared interest, every moment I began to believe someone finally valued my mind was merely strategic calculation designed to win £15,000. What precisely requires explanation that I have not already deduced on my own?" "That I was a fool," Tristan said, his usual composure finally cracking under the weight of genuine emotion. "That I accepted an idiotic challenge from a boy barely out of university because my pride would not permit me to refuse a public wager. That I began this with clinical detachment, viewing you as an interesting problem to be solved, and found myself utterly unprepared for who you actually are. That I fell in love with you truly and completely, and now have no way to make you believe it, because I have so thoroughly destroyed any foundation of trust between us." Honoria stared at him, her grey-blue eyes searching his face for deception or manipulation, looking for any sign that this was simply another strategic move in his campaign. "You expect me to believe that?" "No," he admitted with brutal honesty. "I expect you to doubt every word I say. I would in your place. I have given you every reason to distrust me, and no reason to believe anything I claim now." He drew a folded bank draft from his coat pocket. "I paid the wager this evening before finding you here. £15,000 to Edmund Hartwell, 3 days before the deadline. I lost intentionally because I could not bear the thought of you believing I married you for any reason other than genuine devotion." He held out the receipt proving payment, but Honoria did not take it. "You think paying the wager absolves you? You think financial sacrifice makes your original cruelty acceptable?" "No. I think nothing I do can make this acceptable. But I need you to understand that somewhere between that damned wager and this moment, you became more important to me than my reputation, my pride, or £15,000. You are brilliant and brave and so far superior to anyone I have ever known that the thought of you believing I viewed you as merely a challenge makes me physically ill." Tears gathered in Honoria's eyes, though whether from anger or sorrow or some combination he could not determine. "How dare you do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempts at control. "How dare you make me feel valued and respected and worthy when it was all a game? Do you have any conception of what it cost me to accept these past 3 weeks, to pretend continued interest while knowing I was being manipulated? To smile and converse while dying inside from humiliation?" "You knew," Tristan said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like unwelcome sunlight. "You knew about the wager, and yet you continued to accept my attentions. You continued to appear at events, to engage in our conversations, to permit me to escort you through gardens and introduce you to influential people." "Of course I continued," she replied, her voice gaining strength as anger overcame hurt. "Did you imagine I would simply accept humiliation without response? I am not some helpless creature waiting for rescue, my lord. When I discovered your wager, I declared my own war. Every rumor about your finances, every strategic avoidance of private conversation, every alternative suitor I encouraged, that was my revenge. I was systematically destroying your reputation as thoroughly as you had attempted to manufacture mine. Tristan stared at her with dawning awe and something approaching admiration. She had not been a passive victim of his manipulation. She had been an active opponent, and she had been defeating him with surgical precision while he remained oblivious. The rumors about my tin mines failing, the whispers about financial difficulties, originated from 3 carefully placed comments over 10 days, she confirmed with evident satisfaction. I am quite capable of strategic social warfare when properly motivated, Lord Greystone. You are not the only one who understands how society functions. I have spent 6 years observing these dynamics, so I know exactly which matrons are rivals, which gentlemen hold grudges, where to plant seeds that will grow into forests of speculation. You underestimated me entirely. Despite the gravity of the situation, despite knowing he had lost her perhaps irrevocably, Tristan felt an entirely inappropriate urge to laugh. She was magnificent, absolutely, terrifyingly, wonderfully magnificent. You have destroyed me quite effectively. My reputation is in tatters, my motivations suspected by everyone, my intentions questioned by people who previously would never have dared. I believe you have won whatever contest existed between us. I wanted you to fail, Honoria said, her voice steady now as she met his gaze directly. I wanted you to lose your wager, your pride, your vaunted reputation as the oracle who could arrange any match. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to be reduced to an object of public speculation, to have your worth measured and found wanting, to be entertainment for bored aristocrats with nothing better to occupy their time. I do understand, he said quietly, accepting the justice of her revenge, and you have every right to your vengeance. But Honoria, before you complete your victory and walk away, I need you to know one truth. I love you. Not the woman I thought I could manipulate into marriage, not some project to win a wager. I love the woman who corrects Cambridge scholars on their Latin, who argues political philosophy with genuine passion, who has spent 6 years maintaining dignity in the face of society's casual cruelty. I love the woman who, when faced with betrayal, did not simply withdraw, but fought back with intelligence and precision. I love you with an entirety that terrifies me. He pulled another document from his coat, unfolding it to reveal dense legal text written in his solicitor's meticulous hand. This is a marriage contract I had my solicitors prepare 2 weeks ago, before I knew you had discovered the wager. If you will accept me, these are my terms. Your dowry of £3,500 annually remains under your sole control, managed by trustees of your choosing. You receive an additional £5,000 annually from my estates, paid directly to you and entirely separate from any household allowances. Should I die before you, you inherit 3 properties outright, not merely a widow's portion. Greystone Manor in Hertfordshire, the London townhouse in Cavendish Square, and the estate in Cornwall near the tin mines. You will have complete autonomy over your intellectual pursuits, your correspondence, your choice of companions, your charitable activities. I am offering you not rescue, but partnership, not dependence but independence secured through legal guarantee. Honoria took the contract with trembling hands, scanning the provisions with the careful attention of someone trained to read texts critically. They were extraordinary. They provided a married woman with financial and legal autonomy that was virtually unprecedented in English law. Most marriage contracts transferred all control to the husband. This one guaranteed her rights that even wealthy widows struggled to maintain. Why would you offer such terms? No gentleman offers such terms to a wife. Because you deserve them. Because I respect you too much to expect you to surrender your autonomy in exchange for my name and title. Because if you consent to marry me, I want it to be as an equal choosing a partner, not as a desperate spinster accepting rescue from a powerful lord who holds all advantages. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And because I need you to know that my regard for you transcends every social convention that would position me as your superior. In intellect we are equals, in character you are superior, and in my heart you have a place no one else has ever come close to filling. The conservatory was silent, save for the distant music of the ball continuing without them and the soft sound of Honoria's uneven breathing. She read through the contract again, verifying that the terms were as extraordinary as they had initially appeared. Looking for hidden clauses or limitations, that might nullify the promised freedoms. "I confess," she finally said, her voice carefully measured, "that during our conversations about philosophy and politics, I found myself valuing the man you appeared to be. I despise that weakness. I despise that even knowing the truth about the wager, some part of me still wondered if perhaps there might be genuine feeling beneath the strategy." She paused, looking down at the contract in her hands, at the proof that his words might actually be sincere. "But your actions tonight, this contract drafted weeks ago, paying the wager 3 days before the deadline with no guarantee I would even speak with you, these are not words. These are proof. And I am a woman who believes in evidence rather than protestations." Tristan moved closer, but did not touch her, respecting the fragile nature of this moment when everything hung in precarious balance. "It is not weakness to recognize genuine connection, even in compromised circumstances. You are the strongest person I have ever encountered. You took the most humiliating discovery and transformed it into a campaign that nearly destroyed me. You are formidable." "How can I trust that any of this is real?" she asked, finally looking up at him with such vulnerability that his heart ached. "How do I know you are not simply improving your strategy, offering better terms to secure your objective? How do I know this is not just another move in an elaborate game?" "You cannot know," he acknowledged, accepting that he had destroyed the foundation on which trust might have been built. "I have destroyed any basis for immediate trust through my initial deception. All I can offer is time and consistency. Marry me or refuse me, but permit me to demonstrate through years rather than weeks that my devotion is genuine. Let me prove through sustained action rather than clever words that I value your intellect, your independence, your company, not because they serve some external purpose, but because you are essential to my happiness. I am asking you to take a risk on me despite having every reason not to." Honoria folded the contract carefully, her movements precise despite her emotional turmoil. She considered his words, his actions, the evidence before her. "You paid the wager 3 days before the deadline. You sacrificed £15,000 and your reputation without any guarantee I would even speak with you." "Yes." "You prepared a marriage contract that provides me more autonomy than most wives dream of possessing, more freedom than most widows manage to secure." "Yes." "And you are prepared to spend years proving your sincerity with no assurance of ultimate success. You understand I might never fully trust you." "However long it takes," Tristan confirmed. "Whether it be 1 year or 20, I will endeavor to demonstrate through consistent action that my love for you is the most genuine thing I have ever felt. And if you ultimately decide you cannot trust me, I will accept that judgment as fair." She studied his face in the moonlight filtering through the conservatory glass, searching for any hint of deception or calculation, any sign that this was merely sophisticated manipulation. What she saw instead was raw honesty and patient hope, a man who had gambled everything on a confession that might be rejected. "I want to believe you," she said finally. "I want to believe that something real emerged from such calculated beginnings. But I am terrified of being fooled again, of making myself vulnerable to another betrayal." "Then do not decide tonight," Tristan said gently, though it cost him dearly to suggest delay. "Take the contract. Consult with your father or a solicitor of your choosing. Verify that the terms are as I have represented them. Consider carefully whether you can ever trust me. And know that whether you ultimately accept or refuse, I will spend whatever time remains to me regretting that I gave you any reason to doubt my sincerity." He bowed with perfect formality and turned to leave, unwilling to pressure her further, determined to give her the space and time she needed to make a decision without his influence. But before he reached the conservatory door, Honoria's voice stopped him. "Tristan," he turned back, startled by her use of his given name rather than his title. The intimacy of it sent hope surging through him, despite his determination to maintain low expectations. She was smiling, tentative but real, the first genuine smile she had offered him since discovering the wager. "I will need time to rebuild trust. I will need patience and consistent demonstration of genuine regard over months, perhaps years. I will need to see that your actions match your words not just tonight, but next week and next month and next year. But I believe I see that demonstration beginning already in this contract and in your willingness to lose everything rather than continue the deception." "Then I am the most fortunate man in England," he said softly, scarcely daring to breathe for fear of shattering this fragile moment. "You are the most arrogant man in England who has just learned a valuable lesson about underestimating intelligent women," she corrected, though her tone held amusement rather than anger, "but perhaps also a man capable of learning from his mistakes and growing beyond them. That is more than can be said for most gentlemen of the ton." They stood in the moonlit conservatory, two intelligent, stubborn people who had found each other through the worst possible circumstances and might yet forge something genuine from such unpromising beginnings. Neither was certain of the outcome, but both were willing to try. And perhaps that willingness was itself the foundation on which trust could eventually be rebuilt. The midsummer ball at Vauxhall Gardens marked the precise end of the 6-week deadline Lord Hartwell had established with such confidence. Society attended in unprecedented numbers, eager to witness the resolution of the ton's most discussed wager. The pleasure gardens had been transformed for the occasion, with thousands of additional lanterns illuminating the paths and pavilions. An orchestra had been engaged for dancing, and the supper boxes were filled with aristocratic families, positioning themselves for optimal observation of the evening's developments. Would the oracle succeed at his impossible challenge? Would Miss Sinclair accept an offer from Lord Thornbury, who had been courting her with increasing persistence? Would Lord Greystone appear at all after the financial rumours that had been circulating and the whispers that his campaign had failed? The speculation was intense enough that secondary wagers had been placed on every possible outcome. Tristan arrived unfashionably early and positioned himself near the entrance, waiting with visible tension that was entirely unlike his usual composed demeanour. He wore immaculate evening attire, and despite the whispers about his supposed financial difficulties, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose because he had already sacrificed everything that mattered. His cravat was tied in a perfect mathematical, his coat fit without a wrinkle, and his boots gleamed in the lantern light. When Honoria entered on her father's arm, the crowd fell silent in that particular way that meant everyone was watching while pretending not to watch. She wore a gown of pale gold silk that transformed her usual modest appearance into something remarkable. The fabric caught the lantern light and seemed to glow, complementing her auburn hair which had been dressed with cream roses. Her grey-blue eyes swept the assembled company with calm assessment, noting the avid curiosity, the barely concealed speculation, the eager anticipation of scandal or triumph or both. She saw Tristan immediately. Their eyes met across the crowded entrance, and something passed between them that required no words, a communication of understanding and tentative accord that transcended the public scrutiny surrounding them. She murmured something to her father, who nodded and released her arm with a small smile of paternal approval. The crowd parted as Honoria walked toward Tristan with deliberate purpose. She did not hurry, did not hesitate, did not appear uncertain. Her bearing was that of a woman who had made a decision and would not be deterred from it by public opinion or social pressure. When she reached him, she extended her hand with regal composure. "Lord Greystone," she said clearly enough for nearby observers to hear, her voice carrying in the sudden hush. "I believe we have matters to discuss tomorrow morning. Perhaps you might call upon me at 11 o'clock. There is a particular document I wish to review with you in greater detail, and I have several questions that require your expert clarification." It was a public declaration of receptiveness to his courtship, delivered in language that both acknowledged their intellectual partnership and signaled her willingness to proceed beyond mere acquaintance. It was neither a capitulation nor an unqualified acceptance, but an invitation to genuine negotiation between equals. She was maintaining her power while offering him hope, demonstrating that even in accepting his suit, she would do so on her own terms. Tristan took her hand, bowing over it with profound relief that he did not attempt to conceal. "I shall present myself at precisely 11 o'clock, Miss Sinclair, and I shall endeavour to provide satisfactory answers to whatever questions you may have. I anticipate the discussion will be lengthy and detailed, as befits the serious nature of the matters under consideration." "I have a great many questions," she warned, though her tone held the faintest trace of amusement. "And I expect thorough, honest responses to each one. I am not easily satisfied with vague assurances or charming deflections. I would expect nothing less from a woman of your intelligence and critical thinking abilities," he replied, allowing himself a small smile. "Vague assurances would be an insult to your intellect. I am prepared to provide detailed responses with supporting evidence where applicable." They shared a look that held private understanding and the promise of genuine partnership, and then Tristan led her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz. The orchestra began the familiar strains, and they moved together with a synchronicity that suggested compatibility far beyond mere physical coordination. They danced well together, their movements complementary, their positions balanced. Observers noted that they spoke little during the dance, but they did not need words. Their bodies communicated understanding through the precise movements of the waltz. Around them, the ton erupted in barely suppressed speculation. Conversations buzzed in the supper boxes and along the lamplit paths. Had Lord Greystone won his wager after all? Was Miss Sinclair actually going to accept him? What did her carefully worded statement mean about reviewing documents and having questions? Was there to be a betrothal announcement? The uncertainty was delicious, the speculation intoxicating. Lord Edmund Hartwell, watching from the edge of the dance floor with barely concealed frustration, realized with sudden clarity that he had utterly miscalculated. He had won £15,000, true, collected that very afternoon from Greystone's bank with a receipt properly signed and witnessed. But Tristan Ashcroft, the oracle who had supposedly failed his impossible challenge by conceding before the deadline, had won something far more valuable. He had won the respect and evident affection of a woman whose worth far exceeded any fortune that could be measured in pounds. More remarkably, and this was what Edmund was only beginning to understand, Tristan had won that affection honestly through demonstrated respect and genuine sacrifice, only after his initial manipulative approach had rightfully failed. The oracle's true skill, it seemed, lay not in manipulation, but in recognizing when to abandon strategy in favor of honesty. That was a lesson Edmund himself had not learned, and watching Honoria and Tristan waltz together with evident mutual regard, he suspected it would cost him far more than £15,000 in the years to come. 6 months later, the wedding of the Marquis of Greystone and Miss Honoria Sinclair shocked fashionable society for its numerous departures from convention. The ceremony was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, and the bride insisted on walking to the altar unescorted, a symbolic choice that announced she came to marriage by her own decision, rather than being transferred from father's authority to husband's control. The wedding gift Tristan presented to his wife was not jewels or property, but the establishment of a lending library in her name, free for any woman who wished to study classical texts or pursue education typically denied to females. The gift Honoria gave him was her completed translation of Plato's Symposium, dedicated to the man who taught me that even the most flawed beginnings can lead to genuine love. Lord Edmund Hartwell, prompted by a pointed suggestion from Greystone that the £15,000 might be better spent investing in the intelligence he had so badly misjudged, established an educational fund for women pursuing scholarly endeavors. The Tons spent months dissecting every aspect of the courtship and wedding, but everyone agreed on one point. Miss Honoria Sinclair had demonstrated that a wallflower with sufficient intelligence and courage could not merely survive society's cruelty, but could triumph over it entirely. Dear listener, perhaps you too have been underestimated, dismissed as impossible, written off as too difficult or too different to ever find your place. Remember that Honoria spent 6 years being overlooked before discovering her power. Your intelligence is not a flaw. Your refusal to diminish yourself is not a defect, and anyone worth having in your life will value precisely those qualities that society might tell you to hide. The right person will not ask you to be less than you are. They will celebrate everything that makes you uniquely yourself. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the worst possible circumstances. What matters is not how the story starts, but how both people choose to continue it. Honoria could have accepted victimhood. Tristan could have clung to pride. Instead, they chose honesty, growth, and the courage to build something genuine from flawed beginnings. That choice, renewed every day, is what transforms strategic beginnings into genuine partnership. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, know that being overlooked now does not determine your ultimate value. Your worth is not decided by those who fail to see it, and the right person, when they finally appear, will recognize and celebrate everything that makes you uniquely yourself. Your story is still being written, and the most important chapters may yet lie ahead. Thank you for staying with us through Honoria and Tristan's journey. If this story of intelligence, resilience, and hard-won love touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember their own worth. Your support allows us to continue creating stories that celebrate the overlooked, the underestimated, and the ultimately triumphant.